A very warm welcome this morning to all of our distinguished guests, historians, diplomats, dignitaries, conference participants, keynote speakers, board members, faculty, staff, students, alumni, some AUP parents who are here for graduation, and some new friends of AUP. It is my pleasure to open the proceedings of the first of two centennial conferences revisioning the global history of Paris 1919 as both a making and unmaking of world order, and reflecting next year at Harvard's Kennedy School on the impact of 1919 on a century of public policy. Our business today is not war, but its aftermath, the reactions and interactions and eventual diplomacy that followed it. Thus, our reconsideration of the events and consequences of Versailles at 100 is inevitably a plea for continuing vigilant reflection on the ways that global conflicts both make and unmake the political, legal, social, and cultural worlds we live in. At the American University of Paris, we felt called to undertake this international convening because cross-border conversations and negotiation of difference are at the heart of our educational mission. 57 years ago, Lloyd Delameter, who was a Foreign Service officer, NATO officer, surveyed the wreckage of post-World War II Europe and determined to create a university, to found a college in Paris that would instill in all of those young Americans in the bases across Europe a sense of responsibility for a shared future. He asked a particularly probing question in his biography, which echoes down to us all these years later. How do we transcend the bounds of narrow nationalisms? And we at AUP have been answering that question for 50 years in our classrooms, in our curricula, in our teaching and research. The peacemakers themselves converging on Paris in 1919 from over 30 countries, some with idealistic visions of a League of Nations ensuring collective peace, some with hidden or ambiguous personal agendas, others championing nationalist plans, had to deal with broadly differing and a changing landscape of conditions. So our own students at AUP, holding 107 nationalities this year and speaking 80 different languages and dialects on our campus this very semester, they come to us in Paris not to sing the trite anthem of "It's a small world after all," but rather to engage with real and competing differences, and then to articulate together pragmatic and empowering and federating ways to manage them. That's what our students from all over the world tackle in our Democracy Lab, which is an initiative pioneered by Stephen Sawyer in an effort to reinvigorate democratic institutions at a moment when the great liberal democracies are sharing a certain similar turmoil. And that's also what AUP students will practice together in our future Center for Global Leadership and Diplomacy. That's what discussion in a learning environment inflected by a profusion of nationalities, languages, ethnicities, and faiths produces, and that's why we think of our graduates as cultural translators in a world that has such need of it. So, shouldn't have been a surprise to me when I found out just a few weeks ago that President Wilson, when he came to Paris to negotiate the peace settlements, actually was invited to stay in the home of the maternal great-grandparents of AUP alumnus Achille Bonaparte Murat Guest. But of course Wilson was hosted in the home, at the behest of the French government, in the home of an ancestor of an AUP alum. On a more serious note, when we decided to hold this conference nearly 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, we had only a dawning idea of the relevance of Paris 1919 to the current historical moment, to the rise again of insular nationalisms, not only in Europe and in the US, but elsewhere in the world. For a university such as ours, positioned at the confluence of Paris and France and Europe and the US and the world, the questions you will be taking up in the next few days could not be more pressing nor more important. Margaret Macmillan, who will be our commencement speaker on Monday, as well as our final keynote speaker at the conference, in her remarkable works on Paris 1919, notes that there are over 35,000 books in the English language on the causes of World War I. The aftermath of the Great War and the settlements that resulted have been an equally compelling and vexed subject of inquiry. At this first of the Centennial Conferences, AUP scholars have elected to reframe consideration of the post-war Paris agreements from a typically Eurocentric one, say the ones that reigned at the 75th anniversary conferences, to one based on global and transnational interactions. So I'm exceedingly proud to introduce Stephen Sawyer, who will be speaking very soon, founding chair of history at AUP, refounding chair of history at AUP, director of our Center for Critical Democracy Studies, a current fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, editor of the Tocqueville Review, and author of Demos Assembled, Democracy and the International Origins of the Modern State. I'm also delighted to introduce Albert Wu, his successor as chair of history, a fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany, and a scholar of German missionary and Chinese Christian interactions in the creation of an indigenous Chinese Christian church. I cannot thank more warmly my two faculty colleagues for the bold, broadening way that they have rethought Paris 1909 as a series of globally connected interactions, and for bringing to AUP such a distinguished group of historians and negotiators and diplomats to reflect with them on the implications of such framing. May our deliberations this week be fruitful and collegial and groundbreaking. May they cast light not only on the achievements and outright failures of the peacemakers of 1919, but may they also show us the way forward 100 years later to a way in which sustained negotiation, smart diplomacy, and deft cultural translation can permit us to hear one another's exigencies and to find peaceful ways to live our many and beautiful differences. Thank you very much.